Welcome to our election 2024 coverage from the Gray Media Iowa Television State Capitol Bureau here in Des Moines. I'm Iowa Political Director Dave Price, joined by Connor Hendricks, as we have about 1 hour, I guess about 59 minutes plus, before the polls close in Iowa. And a lot of anticipation ever since that Des Moines Register Iowa poll came out over the weekend, showing that this state may be a little closer than people may have thought. We'll see how the final numbers, if they reflect what that poll showed. Connor, you've been checking in with county auditors across our state. Whenever we have a general election like this, the buzz beforehand is always about turnout. So how's it looking?
Well, Dave, remember back to 2020 when turnout broke records. You know, everybody was voting by absentee ballots due to the pandemic.
Sure.
And we've also since seen that the window for early voting has shortened some. So it's kind of difficult to compare turnout between the years. But in two key counties, between Iowa's two competitive congressional races, we may be setting and breaking a record turnout from 2020. Let me read these out to you.
Okay.
So in central Iowa, Polk County, Iowa's 3rd congressional district, so far today, there have been 212,000 votes cast. That's 88,000 absentee ballots combined with 124,000 votes in person at the polls today as of 4 o'clock. Now, 2020, 253,000 votes cast. So we may be seeing a record here because those numbers were from 4 o'clock, and by that time we still had 4 hours to go until the polls close, that big evening rush, and everybody heads to the polls right after work.
Right.
Now, if we go over to Iowa's 1st congressional district, we may also be setting a record in the heavily Democratic Johnson County. That's where the University of Iowa is.
Sure.
Iowa City is out there as well. So in Johnson County, as of 3 o'clock, there were 26,000 in-person votes plus 45,000 absentee. That is near 80% of the voter turnout in 2020. That's near 80% of voter turnout for the entire county. Now, in 2020, there was 82,000 votes cast. So we are really close to breaking a record in Johnson County as well.
Numbers in both of those, which could have big impacts in that 1st and the 3rd. All right, we're going to hit you again later in this half hour. Appreciate it. As we back off here, I want to reset us to the presidential race for a reason. We bring in Des Moines Register Chief Politics Reporter Brianne Fahnenstiel. Hello, Brianne. I know you're hammering on a deadline here, so appreciate you carving out a couple of minutes here. I had to hit you up after Ann Seltzer's poll came out over the weekend with Kamala Harris up 3 over Donald Trump, especially because of what we saw here the last couple of cycles. And I'm curious, as you're sitting in the newsroom, what was it like when those numbers came in?
It was a doozy. You know, it's always interesting in the 36 hours or so we get those numbers before we make them public. And we were really grateful to have the time to let those sink in a little bit and kind of figure out what was happening there. A lot of jaws were hitting the floor. You know, as Ann Seltzer said, I don't think anyone saw that coming. Even if you're a Democrat feeling the enthusiasm on the ground, there haven't been a whole lot of reliable data points, you know, real tangible data like that to put some numbers to this. So I think it was really shocking for all of us internally as well.
As I fire up the magic wall that we have back here, I'm going to flip us back in time because, as you know, back in 2020, this was not really a race here. And Trump beat Biden 8.2% back in. The math they do for me, so it makes it a lot easier. But he won by about 139,000. And we have a little heat seeker thing we can put on this map. And when you put that on in the state of Iowa, it's just this dark, deep red, right? And so I'm curious, as you started to dig into these numbers, because you all go through these for several days, and you really saw what's going on with independents, what was everybody thinking?
Well, independents, as Ann Seltzer likes to tell us, is kind of a fickle group. And so it's interesting to watch them swing because we have seen them make big swings in the past. But really over the last year, as we've been polling the Iowa presidential race, they've really been solidly behind Donald Trump. And so to see them kind of make this big switch over to Kamala Harris is really interesting. And that top line number is interesting, but especially when you dig down a little further and you see that it's really driven by independent women. Independent women are favoring Kamala Harris on a 28-point margin, which is just really not something we've seen before. And so, of course, you put that in context of what's happening in the state. You know, the 6-week abortion ban that Republicans passed just went into effect this summer. Perhaps we're seeing that, play out in the way voters are feeling about this election.
Another thing that really jumped at me when we were looking at those numbers on Saturday night when those came out were women 65 plus, and the big gap in that race as well between Harris and Trump.
That's right. Women 65 and older favor Kamala Harris in this poll by a 2-to-1 margin, which again is very significant. Older men still favor Kamala Harris, but by a much smaller margin. And so really kind of at both of those levels, you're seeing support among women drive this overall trend. But, you know, we talked to some of the people who respond to this poll after the fact and kind of asked them, why did you make the choice that you did? And I spoke to an older woman who says that, you know, she personally believes that she would never get an abortion, but she doesn't think it's right for the government to tell women what to do with their bodies. And so that's the reason that she's really voting for Kamala Harris this year.
There are always so many great data points in the way Ann does her polls, but one of the things I always appreciate would be like an example of what she just brought up there, because as they're surveying these folks from the beginning, they ask, however they phrase it, would you be willing to have a follow-up from a reporter to kind of talk to you about this? And you get such great insight from people to kind of add to the numerical data to get that backstory. And especially with the 65 crowd, because I've been trying to figure out from people, hey, can this be right? And when you start talking to older women, they talk about, you know, hey, we were around pre-Roe before 1973, and it's just a different thing. And, you know, it's hard to know, you know, will abortion rights be the primary driver when it's all said and done tonight? But clearly there seems to be a shift once this state law is kicked in.
Absolutely. And we asked people too what was driving their vote, what one issue. And so for Kamala Harris supporters, the number one issue they cited was, you know, a desire to protect democracy. But abortion was very clearly the second choice there. And it was a really different set of issues than what was driving Republicans. Republicans said it was the economy, number one, far and away, and then second was immigration.
What about, I think probably another thing that maybe caught me all off guard is, and you don't want to overblow one poll, but since we do have an absence of a lot of state polls, then Ann's poll is really going to get a lot of attention. Then there was the Emerson College poll that also came out Saturday as well. But Trump fell with men, and that would, as we hear a lot of people talk about the gender gap and what that can mean in this race, that would seem to be a point of worry for Republicans if that holds in these final numbers tonight.
I would certainly think so. You know, some other pollsters, some other analysts have said, you know, look at the gender gap and what the overall number is, that if Kamala Harris is leading with women more than Donald Trump is leading with men, then that's a very good sign for her on election night. And that's what we're seeing in this poll. She has a 20-point lead with women. Donald Trump has a 14-point lead with men. If that holds true, certainly in Iowa, that says really good things for the Democrats this year.
What are you following tonight? I know you divide everything up in the newsroom, so what's your story tonight? Give us a little plug.
I'm following the presidential race tonight, Dave. It's got a lot more interest than maybe we would have thought a week or two ago. And so I'm looking really at Polk and Dallas counties, certainly, not only for what they mean for the presidential race, but for that third district contest as well. If Democrats can really boost their turnout there and, you know, have a really strong lead in some of those Democratic-leaning counties going into the end of the night, I think that'll mean good things for them.
We might be a battleground state again. You never know. Thanks, Brianne. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dave.
When you step out, you know, we kind of looked at the map and just, even if this just ends up being competitive, and we'll see how this turns out. But that is something that we're going to definitely have to follow tonight. Just noticing how big that gap was when we were looking at this, and as Connor was talking about before, a couple of these key counties for Democrats that could be key counties when you're talking about Polk County in the center part of the state, and when you're talking about Johnson as you start shooting out east, those are the ones that I think we're going to be paying a lot of attention to as these numbers come in, because those will be the chances for Democrats, if they are going to have a good night, they're going to have to juice up their numbers in both Polk and Johnson County. This half hour we're gonna try to connect with the Dallas County Republican Party chair, who has been, for a lot of reasons, following a lot of things because, let's see if I can back us off to Dallas here. If you're watching from outside Des Moines, you know, Dallas is kind of right just off to the west of Des Moines, and it is the largest, the fastest growing county in Iowa, but it's also one of the fastest growing counties in the entire country. Happens to be my home county, so you can attest. At certain times you see a lot more people there, and a lot of houses being built, and a lot of houses getting sold in that area. But a lot more people coming in, and for a variety of reasons, an interesting place to watch as we kind of do the broader view of the entire state tonight, because of that growth and because of what that can mean. For Donald Trump, we have seen, especially back in 2020, he had problems connecting with some folks in the suburban areas, like suburban women. So as Dallas County blows up in population and has a bigger and bigger impact in the entire district, then, you know, it could have a much bigger say in how this turns out, and especially in that 3rd congressional district, as we look at what happened 2 years ago. I mean, that was close, right? When Zach Nunn was the Republican challenger, Democrat Cindy Axne was the incumbent at that time, and Dallas was close. I mean, you can see how close it was overall, and you can see how close it was in Dallas County as well. So that's where we're going to be. I think Dallas is going to be one of the key ones for us to watch throughout the night. We already talked about the turnout in Polk and Johnson, and then also once you back out and look in that 1st congressional district, to look at all the way to the east, and Scott County will be one that we have to keep an eye on. Connor, why don't you jump back in here for a second? And we talked a little bit about turnout, but one of the other things that Connor has been watching kind of throughout our whole state as we back out so we can get the full 99 county look here. And that was, we had some isolated cases of some issues, right? So up in Story County, and it was something that big picture probably delayed people, and it's going to mean more work for the folks who work in that office.
Right. There was an issue with those voting. There was a technical issue with those voting tabulator machines. You know, when you go and try and put your ballot in. Now, the Iowa Secretary of State's office says that those poll workers just opened up an emergency ballot box that voters could put those in. They're obviously going to do a mandatory, or not a mandatory, administrative, rather, recount to make sure that's okay. The Secretary of State's office also says that no one was prevented from casting their ballot. So all things told, it looks like they got that one under control already. Also, in Polk County earlier this morning, there was long lines at one precinct in Beaverdale. That's a neighborhood here in Des Moines. And the problem was that the voting tabulator was spitting back out ballots when you went to try and put it in, like a vending machine almost spits the dollar back. And it turns out that that was actually voter error, because if you hold on to your ballot, it's going to spit it right back out. So they got that cleared away right away. So all told, it sounds like everything's really running smoothly for the most part across the state. And also, Polk County Auditor Jamie Fitzgerald says that, you know, if you have concerns or you run into concerns when you go to cast your ballot, everything will be okay, because Iowans vote on paper ballots, so there's a paper trail of everything that happened. Now, also, if there's an issue that you run into and you want to report that, the Iowa Secretary of State's office has an election security tip line that you can call that tip into and have that investigated.
I think one of the other things that we were concerned about, which, you know, we were hoping would never be an issue, but as we're watching what's going on in Georgia, your home state, the threats that were made, bomb threats at some of these polling locations that have just been a mess out there. Fortunately, they've been unfounded, it sounds like. And some of them, if not all of them, may have originated somehow in Russia.
Right.
But you're making these people leave. They're going to have to then reopen once everything's clear, somehow get these folks to come back hours later. And that state looks like it's going to set a record with turnout. And in a state where it's a close race, you know, that could be an issue.
Every vote matters in a turnout race like that. So.
But fortunately speaking, we've not heard of any drama like that, any issue like that. I need to check my message here as we try to connect with the Dallas County Republican chair here. I think she's having a little challenges clicking on the link here. Let's back off and look at a couple of these races here. For me, thank you. that first congressional district, I feel like this is one we are going to be following all night, and we've got 44 minutes or so to the polls close. So when you back up here and look at 2022, it's a reminder that this was the rematch, right? So you had Marianne M. Miller Meeks, the Republican. Christina Bohannon was her Democratic challenger. And you just can't, this is sort of like talking about, like we just did with Brianne, when you're looking at that presidential race and it wasn't frankly that close 4 years ago. Well, in this case, 2 years ago, this one wasn't that close. I mean, you're talking about a difference of 20,774 in the district, and almost seven points there, 6.8 if you want to be precise. So what a change 2 years from now, as both parties are looking at this, and when you're hearing both parties say that they expect to be close in the finale, that's when you know something's going on. And for us, I think we're really going to watch Johnson County, as Connor has been talking about all throughout the day in his reporting. The turnout there is especially high. When we back it up to 2022, Bohannon with an overwhelming victory in that county last time, 71.5 to 28.5. And for her, that's kind of the place that she won back in 2022, and a reason why she did not fare well. When you put the heat on here to show the intensity, you see how red the district was, which is why it was so much easier. It was a blowout for Marianne M. Miller Meeks in that county, but everywhere else she did fine. So as we fast forward to 2024, a couple of things to watch. We're going to have to watch how things turn out in Johnson County, but then as you start working your way to the eastern part of the state, and you look at Scott County right here. Let's back that off and see what that was in 2022. All right, 2022, when these two were going here, Miller Meeks took it 52.7 to 47.3 for Christina Bohannon. That is a county that a lot of folks have told me to keep a close eye on. So while we've talked a lot about Johnson County and how Bohannon wants to really push the numbers up, she's done a lot of things at the University of Iowa trying to get those college students to get registered to begin with, but to also turn out to vote. A big point of emphasis for that campaign. But both of them looking at Scott County because of the importance for each one. Clearly, if Bohannon does especially well in Johnson and somehow flips this county, that could end up being a big night for her. As we wait to connect here, I do want to back off and look at that. Let's look at that second congressional district, and give me a little latitude on this one, but there have been some Democrats I've talked to today that, as we know, this district, Ashley Hinson, the former television anchor, the former state representative, the incumbent congresswoman in that district. Her challenger, Sarah Corkery, the Democrat, she's a nonprofit executive. This was not a race that was flooded with all kinds of campaign commercials, especially with all that outside money. Unlike the first and the third congressional district, where every single commercial break, it seemed like, had all that going on. In this one, this was not the case. You just did not see all that outside money. And a big part of that is that Sarah Corkery was not able to raise a lot of money to be competitive in that way, especially early on, that kind of early on show of force to convince people that, hey, this is going to be a player, this is going to be a good race. And a tough race, even though the voting margins there, I think it was 6% or so, the Republicans have the advantage there. So not huge, but the gap was a little bit bigger than the first and the third. However, a few Democrats I was talking to said that if Ann Seltzer's poll is right, and things have indeed shifted a lot in this state, and by that would be Democrats getting reinvigorated by Kamala Harris getting into the race, and the kind of uncertainty about what independents were feeling. Did they want to kind of move on from Donald Trump and support Democrats? If all of that stuff happens, then I was told to watch this district. It would still be a long shot for Sarah Corkery to win this one. So we want to say that up front. But they were saying that if Ann Seltzer's numbers are right, then really pay attention to it and see if this one becomes a little closer than what people thought. All right, I believe we have our next guest connected here. Laura Bellin from the Bleeding Heartland. Thanks for jumping in. I know you're on deadline too, so appreciate you jumping in. What are you watching tonight?
Oh, I'm watching so much and I've been listening to your coverage and I just keep thinking of things I want to add. First of all, I want to let people know for the 3rd district, about 75% of the votes are going to come from Polk and Dallas County, maybe even a little more than 75%. So, but that margin for Lennon Bacam, that's going to be absolutely critical for him to have a huge margin in Polk County. Polk County alone is going to be probably more than 60% of the total vote across the district. And so that for Zach Nunn, he's going to try to keep those margins down. Dallas County, I'm also very interested in that. There's been a lot of spending. There are a lot of competitive legislative races in Polk and Dallas County that I'm keeping an eye on. And so I'm curious to see what happens with the turnout there. As for the 1st district, I wanted to mention something with Johnson County. Everyone probably remembers that Marionette Miller Meeks won by 6 votes in 2020. And there were
Rita Hart does.
Yes, there were about 3,000 people who voted for president in Johnson County who didn't fill out the ballot they didn't vote for any.
They skipped the race, right?
They skipped the race. The race was at the very bottom of the left column of the ballot. But because of how many presidential candidates there were and other things. So I actually looked at the Johnson County sample ballots. It's higher up. It's more like in the middle of the left column. So it shouldn't be as easy for people to miss that. I mean, there are always going to be some people who just vote for president and don't fill out the whole ballot. But sure. I expect the undercount to be a little bit less in Johnson County. Of course, that would be good for Christina Bohannon. Regarding Scott County, there are a couple things I'm very interested in. Democrats there feel that they have a better GOTV this year than they've had in quite a while. So they're optimistic. Also, Marionette Miller Meeks had a very poor showing in the Republican primary, and her challenger, David Pouch, was from the Quad Cities area. In fact, he actually edged her out and got more votes in Scott County. And I'm wondering how many Republicans might leave that ballot blank. Of course, that line of the ballot. Of course, most of them will vote for the Republican nominee. But if even a small fraction of Republican voters come out, vote for Donald Trump and some other candidates, and then leave that line blank, that could be very damaging for Marionette Miller Meeks. Now, one area where I think that Miller Meeks is in a strong position is when you get to the western part of the district. So I'm talking about Warren, Jasper, Marion counties. They're not nearly as big as Johnson and Scott, but there are still a lot of people who live there. And Miller Meeks campaigned there more than Bohannon did. So I think that could be something as the returns come in. Remember that, Johnson may have a huge margin, but Miller Meeks still may have a chance to catch up.
One thing that I was thinking about, and this really may make absolutely no difference in the grand scheme of things. I thought it was very different that Bohannon's campaign the day before the election did not have a single event that was public that the media could go to. And I'm not saying she didn't do anything, because I know they did do some events. It was just interesting to me that we couldn't find out where she was on the day before. That's usually when they have their get out the vote rallies, especially in the evenings. They do, most of them do some kind of bigger gathering, so the TV stations can be live out there in their early evening news, then covered for the late newscast. And it was really unique that didn't happen. Did you make anything of that?
I don't know what the thought process was on that, because Lennon Bacam, of course, had a big GOTV rally in Des Moines. By the way, I don't know, I wasn't able to independently confirm this, but Ashley Hinson has been traveling around the country campaigning for some Republican candidates for U.S. House and other states. And I think Sarah Corkery posted on her social media yesterday that maybe Ashley Hinson was traveling out of the district yesterday, which I thought was strange, but I'm not sure. But I did think it was odd that Ashley Hinson was spending some time campaigning in other states, even in the last 10 days or so before Election Day. But no, I don't really know what the thinking was of not having a big final GOTV rally in the first district. That is unusual, you're right.
And I think both Hinson and Randy Feenstra have helped Zach Nunn, which probably gives us some indication of I'm not saying Republicans are scared about it, but clearly they knew it was going to be competitive.
They were both in the Des Moines area over the weekend, phone banking and trying to get out the vote for Zach Nunn. I mean, he's had a lot of outside help, and who knows, I mean, how it's going to work out. Also, I think it's really important that libertarian candidates were knocked off the ballot in both of those districts. I looked at recent Iowa congressional elections, and when there is a named third party candidate on the ballot, usually that person gets at least a couple of percent of the vote. And when there's no third party candidate, the write-in vote is usually more like 0.1% or 0.2%. So I feel like that could benefit both Zach Nunn and Marionette Miller Meeks.
Hey, Laura, you have a wide network of Democratic activists and organizers, campaign folks. That kind of extended network of yours, what was the buzz Saturday night when that Des Moines Register Iowa poll came out showing Harris up 3? Did people think that was legit? What were they thinking?
Oh, it was a wide range, Dave. I mean, and I have to admit, I'm a bit of a skeptic. I'm a big fan of Ann Seltzer, and I've said before that her last poll looks like an outlier and been proven wrong when it turned out her last poll was on target. But I think even the best pollsters with the best sampling methods sometimes can get a sample that's off just by chance. That's just statistics tells us that, right? 1 out of every 20 polls is off just by chance. And we don't have a lot of other recent Iowa polling to compare it to. I think some Democrats were believing in the number. I do think that late deciders were breaking toward Harris. We've seen evidence from polls in other states and focus groups in other states. And it's possible, since that poll was in the field Monday through Thursday, which were some pretty bad news cycles for Donald Trump, that maybe that could have influenced things. But no, I mean, some Democrats are very upbeat and feel like, hey, we've got a real shot at this. And others said, well, look, even if it's just a little bit closer than 2020 when Joe Biden lost the state by 8 points, if Kamala Harris loses Iowa by 4 or 5 points, it's very likely she's going to win the 3rd district and maybe be close to tied in the 1st district. As you mentioned, I mean, if the poll is accurate, then she would be leading in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd congressional districts, and she would only be behind in the 4th. But I mean, I think I'm not expecting that to happen, but a closer than expected result for Harris would still be really important for down ballot Democrats. A lot of the battleground legislative races are in Polk County, Dallas County, areas where we expect Kamala Harris to do as well as, or maybe a little better than, Joe Biden.
On Bleeding Heartland, you have done some deep dives into the Iowa legislative races. Just give us maybe the top 1 or 2 in the House and Senate that, in your mind, if Democrats take that, it's a good night for them.
Well, the top in the Senate, the top 2, I would say, are Brad Zahn. That's in the northwest suburbs of Des Moines. He's the most endangered Republican. He's the only Iowa Senate Republican representing a district that Joe Biden won. And then Sarah Trone Garriott in the suburban area of Dallas County. That's she may be, well, depending on who you talk to, she may be the most endangered Iowa Senate Democrat. And if she can get through, both of those races have been more than $1 million races in terms of the spending. And so if Democrats were to win both of those races, that could be a sign of a good night. But we may see that in some counties, Trump does a lot better than in Polk and Dallas County. So there may be seats. I mean, there are targeted legislative races that are in all different kinds of communities. Council Bluffs, where Josh Turek has faced hundreds of thousands of dollars of spending against him, and then way over in Dubuque, Chuck Eisenhart. I mean, if Democrats were to lose either the Dubuque House seat or the open Dubuque Senate seat, which is the one that Pam Yoakum represented for a long time and is now retiring from, that would be a sign of a really terrible night for Democrats.
Laura Bellin, appreciate the insight. Thanks for jumping on.
Thank you.
Laura Bellin of the Bleeding Heartland does a lot of deep dive stuff into the election and has had numerous pieces leading into this, especially in some of these state house races that can be so unique based on geography, based on population makeup, based on the candidates, changes all kinds of stuff. A lot of deep dive stuff to look at that. As we look at the clock now, we are at 30 minutes away until the Iowa polls close. Taking a quick glance at CNN as CNN is reporting Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, all still too early to call. A couple of those especially important in this big picture presidential race, of course. Georgia, we're hearing reports about record turnout there. North Carolina would be a big one for Kamala Harris. And then on the other side of it, obviously, Donald Trump, if he can hold on that one, or if he could take Georgia, especially if he takes both of those, that really makes life a lot tougher for Harris as she starts looking at those states where she would have to win to have a good night. And then, of course, Pennsylvania. And we know that that one could be a while before we even get final results for that. Could be quite a while. All right, let's bring in our next guest. I even have a prop for our next guest. Dr. Kelly Winfrey, the author of Understanding How Women Vote, Gender Identity and Political Choices. She is the director at Iowa State of the Women and Genders Study Program. Hello, Dr. Kelly.
Hello.
Hey, what are you watching tonight?
Just reruns.
We do have some rerun races, actually, in some of our congressional races, and we thought we were going to have a rerun on the presidential, but I don't think that's what you mean.
No. I'm watching all of the things at once is basically the answer.
Hey, I had done a piece for today wondering if 2024 would be its own version of the Year of the Woman. What do you make of that?
I think it very well could be. I mean, it will tell us a lot about what is a priority to women voters. Some of the research that I've been doing with this election is around the role of reproductive rights and abortion and how women are voting and feeling about the election. And in large part, majority of women identify as pro-choice. And since the Supreme Court decision in 2022, they're reporting being more engaged and finding abortion and reproductive rights to be more important than other issues in this election and who they decide to vote for. So I think this is the first time we've really tested what does the pro-choice side do when they've lost some of those rights. And I think a big turnout from women that will probably be one of the largest gender gaps in history will be what happens. Now, how that affects the overall count across the Electoral College, that might be a little trickier.
One of the things that stuck out to me when we interviewed you a couple of weeks ago for Inside Iowa Politics was that you were talking about how people who want change tend to be more motivated. So in our state, for a while, it was Republicans and maybe Republican women even, but Republicans in general pushing for changes. And we saw these big changes when it came to abortion rights and various levels of education changes. But as we then go into what is now today, you talked about that it would be more likely that bigger push would be for those who didn't like all of those changes and would want pushing back either to go back the way it was or to have it in some different way. Explain why.
Yeah, well, we usually are more motivated to act if we're not happy about the way something is, right? If we are okay with the world as it is, if we're kind of complacent, we don't feel as much need to get out there and make a difference, and in this case, vote. But if we feel like something is wrong and something's not going the way it should, we're more likely to engage in that way. And so I think in particular with the abortion issue, until the Dobbs decision, it was kind of taken for granted that abortion rights would exist in some fashion across the country. And so it wasn't as big of an issue for pro-choice women, even pro-choice women who tended to vote Republican, because it didn't seem like that was a threat that they needed to really worry about. As those things have changed in the past couple years, that can be a big motivating factor for voters generally, but I'll also say for women voters in particular, what our academic research shows us is that when there are issues that are particularly salient to women, that are about women specifically, that can be a really mobilizing force in either direction. So you have some of that from the pro-life side as well during certain elections. But in this case, I think you're really seeing it from the pro-choice side. And what our polling kind of over several decades has shown us is that the majority of people, and even more so the majority of women, favor some level of abortion access. So as we've seen increasingly restrictive laws across the country, including Iowa, and we hear stories of women being denied life-saving medical care, that becomes something that is really important for people to act on, and they feel more mobilized to do something because they see a problem.
Another thing that stuck out to me, I was playing around with this new system behind me as we were waiting for, we got a little bit longer here before the numbers start pouring in from Iowa. And Kelly, one of the things that stuck out to me is I'm going through the different ones and I'm looking at the race for president. Obviously, we have a woman running there. You look in that first congressional district, both of the major party candidates, women. That second congressional district, the two major party candidates are women, and there's also an independent candidate there. And then you start backing off, and of course Iowa has a female governor, a female United States senator. And has there been some kind of almost tipping point both in our state and nationally with female candidates? And I don't know how to spit this out without offending my wife and every other woman on the face of this earth, but to where it's kind of like not a big thing anymore because it's just normal that we have so many women running? And do I need to run right now so that every woman is not chasing me for saying something offensive?
No, I think you're right to a point. We have, with Joni Ernst in 2014, we were one of the last states that hadn't had a woman as part of our congressional delegation. I think we were one of three at that point who hadn't. And then after Joni Ernst was elected, we saw, more in 2016, 2018 on both sides of the aisle. So there is a normalcy that starts to occur. It also is about getting more women to run for office. What our research shows is that when women run for particularly city or state offices, that they have an equal shot of winning, and sometimes they even win in higher numbers, but they're less likely to run in the first place. Now, the caveat to that is most of the women that do run are more qualified than the average man that runs. And that's part of the difficulty of getting women to run. Where I think, we still have the exception is with the presidency. The presidency is a kind of uniquely masculine office, right? As the president, you are the sole leader, the decider in chief, as one former president said. And so putting all of that power into the hands of one person is scarier to some folks. And so when you think about putting all of that power into the hands of a woman, that frightens either consciously or subconsciously a certain portion of the population. And we don't have any women that have held the office to compare them to. On the other hand, when you're electing a woman to, say, Congress, the U.S. House, that's one of 435 votes. So it's not the same type of leadership. And so there's that difference there. So yes, we've seen more women run, and we're still a really long way from parity, both in the number of women who run nationwide at all levels of office and the representation in state legislatures and our U.S. legislature.
This is an unfair question, and I'm sorry for throwing you on the spot like this. What I have wondered is I was looking at this presidential matchup. Is there any way to know, based on research, what percentage of our population still would not vote for a woman for president? What percent of our population would not vote for an African American? And I appreciate there's probably no way on earth anybody would ever admit to that in a public opinion poll, but is there any way scientifically to quantify any of that?
I think there's a couple, there's a couple different ways that these questions get asked, and we'll probably see after the fact. The American National Election Study collects a large amount of data around presidential vote choice, and then those of us who do research on kind of candidate image can also get at that. One of the things they found in 2008 was that asking people whether you'd vote for a Black man for president, people didn't want to say no, right? But if you asked the question, would your neighbor vote for a Black man for president, you got more honest answers. So that's one polling strategy to kind of get around that, so people don't feel like they're putting their own personal beliefs out there, but they're expressing what they sense others around them and probably, themselves also feel about that. And then the other thing that, I look at with a lot of my research are the variables that we look for in a presidential candidate. So we have in our survey research, we asked voters to evaluate candidates on a variety of traits. And some of those are kind of traditionally more masculine traits, like being strong and active and confident. Some more feminine traits, like being more compassionate. And what you'll see is gender bias in some of those answers, is that women tend to be rated lower, particularly like Hillary Clinton in 2016, as well as some of the research I did with Harris and Warren, Klobuchar, and Pete Buttigieg, interestingly, ranked lower in some of those more masculine leadership traits that people prioritize for the presidency. So while we can't get like the direct, real inside people's heads answer, we can still get at there's probably some bias that affects people's voting decisions. And you know, for some of those, that's not necessarily a conscious thing either. There's kind of a lot of unconscious bias and stereotypes that we hold that we don't really realize we hold until we're confronted with them.
What's something that we have not discussed that has your interest tonight? I'm fascinated by what the percentage of the female turnout will be, and of course, in Ann Seltzer's poll, will the independents indeed break the Democrats' way? And it may be a little bit before we really know that. But what else are you watching?
For me, I think kind of one of the other interesting pieces is how Gen Z votes and the gender gap among Gen Z voters. I think the Ann Seltzer's poll was one that showed, one of several that showed a pretty big split between Gen Z women and men, with Gen Z women being more liberal than older women and more liberal than their male counterparts, but Gen Z men a little bit more conservative. So that's an interesting dynamic that, you know, usually we expect younger voters to lean a little bit more left.
Sure.
So that's one area I'm watching. I'm also really interested in how masculinity plays a role in this, right? We have the tough guy, Donald Trump, you know, he talks about, you know, fighting people, and he's strong and he's going to take what he wants, and that kind of hyper masculine performance. And then you have on the other side, Tim Walz, who's the neighbor that will help you start your car and clean your gutters and, you know, make you a hot dish. So, and it's comfortable being second place to a woman. So there's an interesting conversation, not just about the role of women in society and in politics, but what the role of men might be as well.
I think you'll have more to write about. Dr. Kelly,
Too much.
Thank you much. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
As we check the time, 18 minutes until the polls close in Iowa. We will take a break until the top of the hour, 8 o'clock. So right as we come back on, the polls will close, and we should get numbers almost right away because there was so much early vote. Those tend to be the ones you get right away. So maybe a couple of minutes past 8 o'clock, we'll get our first glimpse about what the races look in the state of Iowa. Until then, enjoy your evening. We'll see you in about 17 minutes.